Lucifer spoke before the tomb was sealed. The church recorded his final words. The public was never meant to know them. That is the part missing from sermons, catechisms, and doctrine. Not because it was myth, because it was documented. 3 institutions, none cooperating with the others, preserved the same moment. The iron lid descended, and the prisoner issued a final statement. Not a scream, not a curse, not propaganda. A sentence, which raises the question this investigation exists to answer. What did Lucifer say beneath the Vatican, and why was the public never allowed to hear it? The church never denied the sealing. It never denied the burial. It never denied the final words. It denied access. The words survived, but they survived in pieces, scattered across centuries and hostile cultures that never compared notes. A Benedictine codex preserved one part. A rabbinic commentary preserved another. An Ottoman court record preserved the third. For centuries, the 3 parts were harmless because they were isolated. None of the institutions understood they were holding fragments of the same sentence. Only when modern scholars assembled them did the meaning become impossible to ignore. Lucifer's final words were not poetry, prophecy, or threat. They were something far worse. They were instruction, and instructions imply a plan, a condition, and most frightening of all, completion. The church buried the records deep enough that no layperson would ever think to reconstruct them. But reconstruction became possible anyway. As a result, the sentence can now be read in full for the first time since the burial. This documentary exists for one reason: to follow the 3 surviving accounts, Catholic, Jewish, and Ottoman, and reconstruct the sentence the church never wanted assembled. Each chapter brings us closer to the answer most people were never supposed to hear. Because if Lucifer spoke before he was sealed, the question is not whether he would return. The question is under what terms. The Catholic account is the oldest of the 3, and the most clinical. It appears not in a sermon, not in a chronicle, but in a Benedictine codex titled simply, De Roem Obsignatum, on the sealed prisoner. The codex records the burial as a procedural event. There is no prophecy, no ornamentation, no speculation. Just the logistical steps of a confinement. It reads like a legal deposition because that is exactly what it is. The relevant passage is concise. Clausura feri descendit, reus locutus est. The iron closure descended. The prisoner spoke. This is the earliest acknowledgement that Lucifer issued a final statement at the moment of sealing. The codex then provides the fragment itself, quoted in ecclesiastical Latin, Vincula mea sunt lapsus hominum. The literal English rendering is, My chains are the failings of men. The codex offers no commentary on what failings refers to. The monks were not theologians in this context. They were clerks. Their duty was to record, not interpret. This absence of interpretation is what makes the Catholic fragment so unsettling. Church documents interpret everything. They debate, annotate, argue, condemn, contextualize. But here, nothing. Just a statement of fact. The prisoner spoke. He said one sentence. He was sealed, and the clerks moved on. This leaves 2 immediate questions. What failings, and why would failings constitute chains? To understand how 14th century clerks would have heard this line, we need to understand their worldview. In medieval Catholic theology, failings did not usually refer to sin. Sin was addressed through absolution. Sin could be forgiven. Failings referred to something else entirely, the breakdown of discipline. Discipline in that era meant adherence to hierarchy, the obedience that sustained church, crown, and order. If Lucifer said his chains were the failings of men, then from a medieval perspective it implies Lucifer was not held by iron, but by obedience. And obedience was not a religious concept. It was a civil one. It held armies together. It held families together. It held kingdoms together. It held reality together as far as medieval society understood it. This raises the first major implication of the Catholic clause. If Lucifer's chains are human failings, then his imprisonment is not a one-time act. It is a condition. Conditions change. Iron does not rust in heaven or hell. but obedience rusts on earth. The Benedictines would not have missed that implication, and yet they did not comment on it. That silence matters. The Church only stays silent on doctrines when interpretation becomes dangerous. Because if Lucifer's chains depend on human obedience, then his release does not come through war, rebellion, or ritual. It comes through societal decay. And here's where the Catholic account becomes more ominous than all the prophecy and revelation. The codex adds one final line unrelated to the prisoner himself. Judicium in posterum. Judgment deferred to the future. Deferred is not denied. Deferred implies inevitability, not if, but when. If we stop here, the Catholic account alone is enough to raise uncomfortable questions. If obedience was the mechanism of imprisonment, what happens when obedience collapses? And obedience has been collapsing for centuries. The monasteries would have understood that their own relevance was eroding long before modernity finished the job. But we haven't reached the disturbing part yet. The Catholic clause tells us what the chains are. It does not tell us how long they hold, or who they bind on behalf of, or what happens when they fail. Those answers come later, and they do not come from the Church. Because the second account does not speak of chains at all. It speaks of witnesses. And unlike the Benedictines, the scribes of the second tradition had no interest in protecting doctrine or preserving silence. Where the Catholic account recorded without comment, the second account analyzed, questioned, and almost reached the conclusion the Church feared most. If the first account makes the burial real, the second makes it impossible to ignore. If the Catholic account documented the event, the Jewish account tried to understand it. It appears not in a church archive, but in the margins of a commentary on the Book of Daniel, copied by a rabbi in either the late 1400s or early 1500s. The commentary itself is on eschatology, but the marginal note is not. The scribe writes simply, "There is a sealed one, and he spoke." This tells us two things immediately. First, the burial was not a Christian secret. Second, the information circulated across borders more rapidly than theologians would like to admit. The rabbi then quotes the sentence as he heard it, in Hebrew, and then translates it into Aramaic for clarity. When rendered back into English, the line reads, "The last witness has not yet been born." This sentence is unlike the Catholic clause in one critical way. It introduces a timeline, or more accurately, a delay. To medieval Jewish scholars, the idea of a witness did not mean bystander. It meant validator of covenant. In rabbinic legal tradition, no contract, no transfer, and no judgment is considered legitimate without someone to witness it. This immediately reframes the burial not as punishment, but as procedure. The rabbi's commentary makes this explicit. He writes, "If there must be a last witness, then there must also be a last day." To him, Lucifer's statement was not prediction or threat. It was scheduling. But the rabbi goes further than the Benedictines ever would. He tries to identify who the witness must be. At first, he assumes the witness must be a prophet. But he crosses that out. Prophets witness God, not prisoners. Then he suggests the witness must be Israel as a people. But he crosses that out too. Israel is collective, not singular. Only in his third attempt does he arrive at the conclusion that unsettles the commentary. The witness is not yet living. Which means the burial could not complete until the witness exists. Which means the burial was not closure. It was delay. The rabbi then attempts to categorize the nature of the witness. In Jewish jurisprudence, there are three types of witnesses: those who validate the event, those who validate the contract, those who validate the outcome. He rules out the first two immediately. The burial required no validation. The Church performed the act. The nations accepted it by their participation. That leaves only the third category: the witness of outcome. This is the most dangerous category because it implies the witness does not validate the burial. The witness validates whatever comes after. The rabbi then writes a line that appears in no Christian record and no Islamic record. When the witness lives, the sealed one shall arise to meet him, not escape. not conquer, not revolt. Meet. In rabbinic jurisprudence, meetings are not battles, they are hearings. This interpretation would have been impossible for a medieval Christian to reach, because Christianity frames Lucifer as rebellion, not litigation. But to the rabbi, the burial was legal, not military. This raises the uncomfortable implication. Lucifer was not imprisoned. He was adjourned. Adjournments end when all parties are present. And according to the rabbi's account, one party, the witness, did not yet exist. The rabbi's marginal note ends with a final clarification, written almost reluctantly. It concerns the nations. This single sentence redefines the entire burial. The Catholic account implied the chains depended on obedience. The rabbinic account implies the release depends on witness. And the witness concerns not Israel, not Rome, not Islam, but the nations, plural. Meaning the burial was never local. It was never tribal. It was never about one people or one covenant. It was global. And here is where the scope of the documentary widens. Because if Lucifer's final words require a global witness that did not yet exist at the time of burial, then the burial could not end in the medieval period. Globality did not exist. There was no global communication, no global identity, no global world order, no global witness, not until modernity. Which raises the question medieval scholars could not possibly answer. Who is the witness now? Or worse, has the witness already been born? But the Catholic and rabbinic accounts still do not tell us the most critical detail. How long was the burial meant to last? Chains describe mechanism. Witness describes validation. But neither describes duration. For that, we have to turn to the third account. If the first account makes the burial procedural, and the second makes it global, the third makes it inevitable. The next account does not come from clerics or rabbis. It comes from a legal translator of the Ottoman court. And unlike the other two, their language has a word for expiration. The third account is the most inconvenient for the Church because it does not come from any Christian or Jewish tradition. It comes from bureaucracy. Specifically, from an Ottoman court translator tasked with verifying foreign legal documents for the Sublime Porte. The translator was not a theologian. He was an administrator. His job was to categorize documents, not interpret them. This is exactly why his account matters. Unlike clerics or rabbis, he had no interest in prophecy, covenant, or eschatology. He had one question. What kind of sentence is this? The record he copied was already in Latin. He translated it into Ottoman Turkish using the legal framework of the court. The clause he translated reads in English as, "When men cease to bow, I will stand." Where the Benedictines heard chains and the rabbi heard witness, the Ottoman heard condition. The translator labeled the clause with the term used for legal agreements with a deferred outcome. Muddat, duration or term. This categorization changes the nature of the burial more than any sermon or commentary ever could. Because the translator was not asking what Lucifer meant. He was asking when Lucifer stands. In the legal structure of the Ottoman court, muddat does not mean prophecy or prediction. It means the time between the start of an agreement and its expiration. The Benedictines recorded the mechanism, the rabbi recorded the validation, the Ottoman recorded the clock. But here's the detail the Church never wanted anyone to understand. The translator does not translate bow as worship. He translates it as submission to authority. In Ottoman Turkish, the word he uses is the same word used for submitting to the Sultan, submitting to the court, submitting to law, submitting to hierarchy. It is not vertical devotion. It is horizontal order. So the clause does not mean when men stop worshiping God. It means when men stop recognizing authority. That is a measurable condition. Modernity has a word for it: collapse of hierarchy. For most of human history, hierarchy was assumed. Kings ruled, priests dictated, judges sentenced, people bowed, not out of piety, out of structure. Today, none of those hierarchies survive uncontested. Kings are ceremonial, priests are optional, judges are negotiable, Teachers are replaced by search engines. Parents compete with screens. Truth competes with opinion. In the medieval period, the condition for release was unthinkable. In the modern period, it is normalized. The translator adds a final notation almost as an afterthought. Hüküm kıyamda. Judgment stands. To an Ottoman bureaucrat, this phrase means something very specific. Standing is what a case does once it becomes active. It does not mean uprising or rebellion. It means the docket is live. This means the translator understood Lucifer's clause not as threat, but as activation. When men cease to bow, the buried one does not escape, revolt, or conquer. He stands. And standing in legal language means only one thing. The case resumes. At this point, the meaning of the three accounts becomes impossible to ignore. The Catholic clause identified the mechanism. Obedience equals chains. The rabbinic clause identified the witness. Someone must validate the outcome. The Ottoman clause identified the duration. Chains hold only while society bows. None of these accounts contradict. They align, which raises the question medieval theologians never had to ask. What happens when the duration ends? Because the Ottoman clause does not say, if men cease to bow. It says, when. There is no contingency, only inevitability. And this leads us directly to the moment viewers have been waiting for, the point the Church never wanted assembled in full, the sentence as spoken, the three clauses combined. The words themselves were not forbidden. Their assembly was. For the first time, we are now in a position to reconstruct the prisoner's final statement in full, as it was spoken and as it was meant. And once assembled, the meaning becomes unavoidable. When the Catholic, rabbinic, and Ottoman clauses are placed in sequence, something happens that none of them reveal on their own. The sentence stops being theological and becomes procedural. To reconstruct it, scholars did not look to prophecy, mysticism, or demonology. They looked to the language of contracts. Lucifer spoke in ecclesiastical Latin, the language the Church reserved not for sermons, but for agreements, judgments, and legal acts. Here is the reconstructed sentence as it appears in Latin. Vincula mea sunt lapsus hominum. Testis novissimus nondum natus est, cum homines desinunt flecti, sto. Rendered into English, without ornamentation, it reads, my chains are the failings of men. The last witness is not yet born. When men cease to bow, I will stand. 22 words. No prophecy, no threats, no poetry. For nearly 600 years, the fragments sat in different worlds. A Benedictine codex locked behind Vatican inventory numbers. A rabbinic commentary sitting unnoticed on a shelf in Kraków. An Ottoman ledger boxed in the archives of Istanbul, mislabeled as maritime correspondence. None of these records were secret. They simply had no reason to ever meet. The reconstruction only happened because of a Dominican linguist named Adriano Tassi, a man who did not believe in demons, prophecies, or conspiracies. He believed in grammar. Tassi discovered the rabbinic fragment first, not because he was looking for it, but because he was cataloging marginalia for an academic index no one would ever read. The phrase disturbed him for one reason. It referenced a sealed prisoner, but not a prison. It referenced a burial, but not a grave. It referenced a witness, but not a trial. And above all, it referenced a future event with a tone of inevitability that did not match any known prophetic literature of the period. Tassi traced the wording through trade records, merchant correspondence, and court documents until he found a Latin parallel in the Vatican's private inventory. The Benedictine fragment matched the structure of the rabbinic note, but not the content. That was the first time anyone realized the fragments were components, not narratives. The Ottoman fragment appeared next, pulled from the archives after the Republic began digitizing its imperial records. A legal translator had labeled the clause under the terminology used for deferred agreements, not religious oaths. That classification changed everything. The Church classified the event as burial. The rabbi classified it as delay. The Ottoman classified it as term. 3 institutions, 3 cultures, 3 centuries apart, speaking about the same moment. Scholars hate coincidence. So does the Church. 4 months after Tassi published his preliminary index, the Vatican purchased the original codex. Not the commentary, not the ledger, only the codex. The purchase was quiet, processed through the Jesuit curia, and filed under private custody. The official justification was preservation. The timing said otherwise. Tassi died 2 years later, officially of a pulmonary infection. His notes vanished into private hands. For 2 decades, nothing happened. The fragments slept again. Academic interest withered. The Church did not deny. It did not debate. It did not defend. It waited. But history does not wait forever. By the early 20th century, the world had changed in a way the medieval custodians could not imagine. Empires fell, nations globalized, information accelerated, and for the first time in recorded history, a single narrative could be witnessed by the entire planet at once. The rabbi's clause, "The last witness has not yet been born," had always been treated as metaphor. Suddenly it wasn't. The witness existed. It had cameras. It had archives. It had networks. It had memory. That left the third clause, the trigger. "When men cease to bow, I will stand." Scholars debated what bowing meant for decades. The Church insisted it was spiritual. Historians argued it was political. Sociologists argued it was cultural. But there was a darker interpretation none of them wanted to print. Bowing is what the conquered do. And Lucifer was not buried as a criminal. He was buried as a defeated general. Defeated generals do not die. They wait. The fragments do not describe repentance, salvation, or redemption. They describe a ceasefire. Ceasefires end when conditions break, and every condition described in the fragments belongs to us, not to him. The burial depended on obedience. Obedience dissolved. The burial awaited a witness. The witness arrived. The burial required a world that bowed. The world refused. The 3 fragments explain how he returns. None explain why. That answer belonged to the 4 custodians whose testimonies never entered circulation. The missing accounts do not describe chains, witnesses, or conditions. They describe motive. And motive is always more dangerous than mechanism. If Lucifer rises as conqueror, the Church can tell a story. If Lucifer rises as judge, the Church can claim prophecy. But if Lucifer rises for reasons no institution controls, then the story does not belong to the Church at all. It belongs to him. That is the part no theologian, no scholar, and no government has ever been willing to address. The fragments do not describe a return we can prepare for. They describe a return we caused. If the fragments explained the mechanism of return, the missing 4 testimonies explain the only question that ever mattered. Why was Lucifer buried instead of destroyed? The Church's preferred explanation has always been theological. Lucifer survives because angels cannot die. But that answer collapses under the smallest pressure. If Lucifer could not be destroyed, the natural alternative would have been containment, not burial. Containment implies immediate threat. Burial implies delay. Burials are for the defeated. Delays are for the unfinished. The Benedictines understood that distinction, and so did the political authorities who signed the sealing orders. The theology of the period insisted Lucifer was the enemy of heaven, a rebel against divine order. But the burial does not read like the aftermath of a rebellion. It reads like an armistice. Wars end when one side wins. Armistices end when conditions fail. The fragments describe the latter. The second question the missing testimonies would have answered is even worse. Why did 7 religions participate? No Christian doctrine requires interfaith cooperation to destroy evil. If anything, the opposite. Yet the ledgers list custodial payments to clerics, rabbis, imams, and representatives of 2 additional traditions lost to time. not witnesses. Custodians. Custodians are responsible for maintenance, not celebration. The third question is the most dangerous of all. Why was the burial sealed beneath the Vatican? Rome was not chosen for sanctity. It was chosen for administration. The medieval church had the only bureaucracy capable of maintaining a long-term custodial treaty, not a prison cell. A treaty. Treaties require enforcement. Enforcement requires parties. Parties require terms. Terms require compliance. Compliance, as the fragments reveal, did not concern heaven. It concerned mankind. The final implication of the fragments, once reconstructed, is the one no theologian wanted to print. Lucifer did not lose a war. Lucifer agreed to wait. Which forces the fourth question, one that turns the entire burial inside out. Wait for what? Modern theologians avoid that question because it leads to a conclusion both catastrophic and theologically consistent. Lucifer agreed to wait for mankind to prove it could govern itself without him. The medieval custodians believed that day would come. They assumed human history pointed toward improvement, toward discipline, hierarchy, reason, structure, stability. They did not anticipate a world where every authority dissolves and every hierarchy is voluntary. They did not imagine nations that rule by appetite instead of restraint. They did not imagine citizens who view obedience as insult rather than virtue. They did not imagine a world where no one bows to anything except their own desire. If Lucifer returns as conqueror, the burial was a failure. If Lucifer returns as witness, the burial was a formality. But if Lucifer returns as sovereign, the burial was an evaluation. The question is not whether he returns. The fragments assume that as certainty. The question is what the return signifies. Not apocalypse, not revenge, not salvation, simply transfer of authority. Every empire in history ends the same way. The sovereign loses legitimacy, and the governed seek a stronger power. In the medieval world, that stronger power was the church. In the modern world, no such power exists. Governments rule by permission. Institutions rule by branding. Truth competes with entertainment. The medieval custodians would have recognized this as failure. Lucifer would recognize it as opportunity. This reframes the burial entirely. The church did not seal Lucifer to protect mankind from him. It sealed Lucifer to protect the world from itself. The medieval world was not ready to submit to whatever rulership Lucifer intended to impose. The modern world has already submitted to chaos, which leads to the final, forbidden implication of the reconstructed fragments. Lucifer does not return because he escapes. Lucifer returns because we default. When order fails, power consolidates. When power consolidates, sovereignty transfers. The medieval custodians understood that power abhors a vacuum. They assumed the vacuum would never come. They assumed mankind would grow into the throne it insisted on occupying. Instead, mankind dismantled the throne and replaced it with appetite. The missing 4 testimonies would have explained the terms of succession. The church suppressed those testimonies for the same reason monarchs erase rival claims, to avoid acknowledging a superior one. This is why the fragments end not in theology, but in geopolitical terror. Lucifer's return is not framed as invasion, uprising, or cosmic war. It is framed as accession, ascension to a throne forfeited by neglect. And now the question no one in Rome, Jerusalem, Istanbul, or Washington wants to answer. If Lucifer was buried as a defeated rebel, why does he rise as a king? The medieval custodians believed the throne belonged to mankind by divine inheritance. The fragments suggest that inheritance was conditional, and conditions, once broken, transfer rights. This is the part that the Vatican will never confirm publicly, but is whispered privately in the archives by those who have seen the ledgers. Lucifer does not return to conquer the world. He returns to claim it. And kingdoms are not claimed by force. They are claimed by right. Because in every sealed treaty, one clause stands above all others. If the sovereign fails, the throne reverts. If the fragments are true, then the throne of the world was never ours to keep. It was ours to prove we deserved. And we proved the opposite. Which is why the final fear of Lucifer's return is not destruction. It is coronation. Because the one thing mankind fears more than a world ruled by Lucifer is a world that deserves to be. Lucifer isn't coming back for war. He's coming back for the throne we abandoned.